The cold English morning of March 1943 brought another nightmare for the American bomber crews. Sergeant James Caldwell stood on the runway at Debden Air Base, watching black smoke rise from the distant Channel waters. Another P-51 Mustang had gone down, but this time it was not German bullets that killed the aircraft. The engine had simply stopped working at 26,000 feet, and the pilot barely made it back before ditching in the freezing water. Jimmy wiped grease from his hands and felt anger building in his chest. This was the fourth fighter lost to engine failure in 2 weeks. He was a mechanic, 24 years old, from a small town in Ohio. Before the war, he had studied engineering for 2 years before money ran out. Now, he fixed aircraft in England while German bombers tried to kill him every other night. The war in Europe was not going well for the Americans in early 1943. Their giant B-17 and B-24 bombers were flying deep into Germany to destroy factories and railways. But German fighters were slaughtering them. Without fighter escorts that could fly far enough and high enough, the bomber crews were dying by the hundreds. The P-51 Mustang was supposed to solve this problem. It had the range to escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. But it had one terrible weakness that was killing pilots at high altitude, above 25,000 feet. The Merlin engine inside the Mustang would start to overheat. The thin air at that height made cooling difficult. When the engine got too hot, it would lose power. Pilots would have to descend to thicker air or risk the engine seizing completely. This meant they had to abandon the bombers exactly when the bombers needed protection most. German fighters would wait at high altitude and pounce the moment the Mustangs dropped away. Jimmy had watched too many pilots come back with haunted eyes, talking about bombers burning and falling while they could do nothing but run for lower altitude. His best friend among the pilots was Lieutenant Marcus Webb, a tall man from Texas with a quick smile that was fading more each day. Marcus had flown yesterday's escort mission to Frankfurt and came back quiet and angry. "We got to 27,000 feet and my engine started cooking," Marcus told Jimmy that evening in the hangar. Temperature gauge was climbing into the red. "I could see the German 190s up there waiting for us, but I had to drop down. 3 bombers got hit while I was useless below them. Good men died because this bird cannot stay cool up high." Jimmy looked at the Mustang they were standing beside. It was a beautiful aircraft, sleek and deadly looking. The North American Aviation Company had designed it well, but something was wrong with how the cooling system worked at altitude. The official reports said engineers were working on the problem, but engineers were in California and Ohio, while men were dying here in England today. That night, Jimmy could not sleep in his cold barracks. He kept thinking about the cooling problem. He got up in the darkness and walked to the hangar. The guard knew him and let him pass. Inside, the Mustang sat in rows, silver shapes in the dim light. Jimmy grabbed a flashlight and crawled under Marcus's aircraft. The Mustang used a liquid cooling system for its Merlin engine. Hot coolant flowed through a radiator under the aircraft's belly, where airflow was supposed to cool it down. Jimmy studied the radiator air intake scoop. It was a simple square opening that let air flow through the radiator and out the back. The faster the aircraft flew, the more air flowed through. That was the theory, but Jimmy saw the problem. At high altitude, the thin air was not carrying away heat efficiently enough. The scoop design was wasting the energy of the high-speed airflow. Air was just flowing through and creating drag without doing maximum cooling work. Jimmy remembered his engineering classes about thermodynamics and fluid dynamics. There was a principle about using airflow more efficiently, about turning the drag of a cooling system into something useful, that he spent 3 hours under that aircraft, measuring and sketching by flashlight. The other mechanics would think he was crazy. The engineering officers would be angry if they knew he was studying modifications without authorization. But Jimmy did not care anymore. He had an idea forming in his mind, a way to reshape the scoop and redirect the airflow. It was risky and completely against regulations. Mechanics were supposed to maintain aircraft exactly as designed, not experiment with modifications. When dawn came, Jimmy had rough drawings and calculations. He walked across the cold airfield to the pilot's quarters and knocked on Marcus's door. The lieutenant opened it looking tired and suspicious. "I can fix your cooling problem," Jimmy said quietly. "But you have to trust me and not ask questions. What I want to do is not approved. I could face court-martial if this goes wrong. But if it goes right, you will be able to stay at high altitude and protect those bomber boys." Marcus studied Jimmy's face for a long moment. They had known each other for 8 months now. Marcus trusted this mechanic more than he trusted most officers. He thought about yesterday's mission, about the burning bombers, about the pilots who did not come home. "When do we start?" Marcus asked. Jimmy smiled for the first time in days. "Tonight, after the officers go to sleep. Bring coffee. We're going to rebuild your radiator intake, and we're going to do it before anyone notices." The war was about to change because of what these two men would do in the darkness of that hangar. They did not know it yet, but their unauthorized work would help in the battle for Europe's skies. The night air inside the hangar was freezing, but Jimmy Caldwell was sweating as he worked beneath Marcus Webb's Mustang. His hands moved carefully with metal shears and a small welding torch. Marcus stood watch near the hangar door, pretending to smoke a cigarette, while keeping an eye out for the engineering officer who sometimes made late rounds. It was their third night of secret work. Jimmy had spent the first 2 nights just studying the radiator system and making precise measurements. He needed to understand exactly how the air flowed through the cooling system before he could change it. The Mustang's Merlin engine produced tremendous heat, especially at full power. That heat had to go somewhere, and at high altitude, where the air was thin and cold, getting rid of it was harder than anyone had expected. Jimmy's modification was based on a principle he remembered from his engineering classes. When air flowed through the radiator, it got heated by the hot coolant. That heated air expanded and wanted to move faster. If he could shape the exhaust duct correctly, he could use that expanding air to create a pushing force instead of just drag. It was almost like getting free thrust from waste heat. Some engineers called it the Meredith effect, but Jimmy just thought of it as basic physics. The problem was that reshaping the radiator scoop and exhaust was delicate work. One mistake, and he could actually make the cooling worse. Or he could create turbulence that would affect the aircraft's flight characteristics. Marcus was literally trusting Jimmy with his life. If this modification caused the aircraft to handle badly in combat, Marcus could die. "How much longer?" Marcus whispered from the door. "I heard footsteps outside 10 minutes ago." "Almost done," Jimmy replied, his voice echoing slightly from under the aircraft's belly. "Just need to weld this last brace, and we can test fit the new exhaust duct." In a wider world beyond their hangar, the air war over Europe was reaching a critical point in the spring of 1943. American bomber losses were becoming unsustainable. In recent raids on German industrial cities, 1 out of every 10 bombers was failing to return. The men who flew those missions called it flying into hell. German fighters would attack in waves, focusing on bombers that lost formation. Without fighter escorts that could stay with them at high altitude, the bomber crews were vulnerable. The British Royal Air Force had been fighting this war longer than the Americans. They had learned hard lessons about the importance of air superiority. But British fighters like the Spitfire had limited range. They could not escort bombers deep into Germany. The Americans needed the P-51 Mustang to work perfectly, not just adequately. Every small improvement could mean the difference between life and death for hundreds of airmen. Jimmy finished welding and slid out from under the Mustang. His hand was shaking slightly, partly from cold and partly from nerves. The modification was complete. He had reshaped the air intake scoop to be more efficient and redesigned the exhaust duct to use the heated air expansion for forward thrust instead of pure drag. On paper, it should work, but paper did not shoot back at you or try to kill you at 400 miles per hour. "It is done," Jimmy said, wiping soot from his face. "The new design should cool the engine better and actually give you a tiny bit of extra speed from the exhaust thrust. But we will not know for sure until you fly it." Marcus walked over and looked at the modification. To his untrained eye, it looked like Jimmy had simply reshaped some metal ducting. But he trusted that his friend knew what he was doing. "When should I test it?" "Tomorrow's mission," Jimmy said. "You are escorting bombers to Bremen, right? That is a high-altitude run. You will need to go to 28,000 feet or higher. If the modification works, Your engine should stay cool even at full power up there. If it does not work, he did not finish the sentence. Marcus lit another cigarette and thought about it. The mission to Bremen would be dangerous regardless. German fighters would be waiting. The Luftwaffe had strong forces defending that area because of the submarine pens and factories. If his engine failed a high altitude during combat, he would be a sitting duck. But if this modification worked, he could stay up high and keep the German fighters off the bombers. I will fly it, Marcus decided. Those bomber crews deserve fighters that can protect them. If we do nothing, good men keep dying. At least this way we are trying to fix the problem. The next morning came cold and gray. Jimmy watched from the ground as Marcus's Mustang taxied to the runway with 36 other fighters. The bombers had taken off earlier, heavy B-17 flying fortresses loaded with bombs for Bremen's industrial targets. The fighters would catch up to them over the channel and escort them into Germany. Jimmy's stomach was tight with worry. He had broken regulations, modified a military aircraft without authorization, and convinced his friend to risk his life testing the modification in combat. If anything went wrong, it would be his fault. But if nothing changed, men would keep dying because the Mustangs could not stay cool at high altitude. The fighters roared down the runway and lifted into the cloudy sky. Jimmy watched until they disappeared, then walked slowly back to the hangar. He would not know if the modification worked until the fighters returned, probably in 5 or 6 hours. It would be the longest day of his life that, at 28,000 feet over the North Sea, Marcus Webb pushed his throttle forward and watched his engine temperature gauge. Usually by this altitude, at full power, the needle would be climbing toward the red zone. But today it stayed firmly in the green. His Mustang felt strong and responsive. The modification was working. Marcus smiled inside his oxygen mask. Jimmy had done it. Now they just had to survive the next few hours over Germany and get home to tell him the good news. The German fighters came out of the sun like hawks diving on prey. 6 Focke-Wulf 190s, silver and deadly, dropping toward the American bomber formation at 400 miles per hour. Lieutenant Marcus Webb saw them coming and pushed his throttle to full power, climbing to intercept. At 28,000 feet, his Mustang's engine sang smoothly. The temperature gauge stayed in the safe zone. Marcus felt a surge of confidence that he had not experienced in months. For the first time at this altitude, his aircraft was not struggling and overheating. Jimmy's modification was working exactly as promised. The lead German fighter opened fire on B-17 at the edge of the formation. Marcus closed the distance and fired a burst from his 6.50 caliber machine guns. Tracers walked across the sky. The Focke-Wulf broke away, but Marcus stayed with him. His Mustang held speed and power where normally it would have started to falter. The German pilot tried to climb away, but Marcus followed effortlessly. Another burst, and the German fighter trailed smoke before spiraling down. When Marcus landed back at Debden 6 hours later, Jimmy was waiting on the flight line. The mechanic's face was tight with worry until he saw Marcus's thumbs-up signal from the cockpit. Marcus climbed down and grabbed Jimmy's shoulder. "You beautiful bastard," Marcus said, grinning wide. "She ran 10 degrees cooler than normal the whole mission. I stayed at 28,000 feet for 2 hours without any problems. And I got a 190 that would have killed a bomber if I had been forced down low." Jimmy felt relief wash over him like warm water. No handling problems? No WWII. Nothing. She flew better than before, if anything. I swear I had more top-end speed too. Marcus lowered his voice. "We need to do this to more birds. Every fighter in the squadron needs this modification." But modifications had to be kept secret. The engineering officers would not approve unauthorized changes, no matter how well they worked. Over the next 2 weeks, Jimmy worked late nights, modifying for more Mustangs. Each time he worked carefully and quietly, with pilots standing watch. Marcus spread the word quietly among trusted friends in the squadron. Only pilots who would keep their mouths shut got their aircraft modified. The war news in April 1943 was grim. German U-boats were sinking Allied ships faster than they could be replaced. The battle for North Africa was fierce and bloody. and the bombing campaign over Germany was costing terrible losses. But the handful of pilots flying Jimmy's modified Mustangs started bringing back different stories. Lieutenant Sarah Chun, one of only 2 female pilots in the squadron flying liaison duties, but who had talked her way into one escort mission, borrowed a modified Mustang and held position at 29,000 feet for the entire mission to Wilhelmshaven. She reported perfect engine temperature and actually caught a German Me-109 that thought it was safe at extreme altitude. Captain Robert Hayes flew a modified bird to Hanover and got into a swirling dogfight with 3 German fighters at 27,000 feet. His aircraft never overheated. He shot down 2 Germans and damaged the third. The performance advantage was becoming impossible to hide, but there was one German pilot who was making the bomber crews suffer more than any other. The American pilots called him the Devil of Dortmund. German records named him Ernst Hoffmann, a veteran ace with 37 confirmed kills. Hoffmann specialized in attacking bombers at extreme high altitude where American escorts struggled with overheating engines. He would wait at 29 or 30,000 feet, and when the Mustangs had to drop away, he would dive on the bombers with his squadron on a cold morning in late April. Marcus Webb took off knowing that Hoffmann had been active in the area they were heading to. The target was an aircraft factory near Dortmund. The bombers would have to fly high to avoid flak, which meant Hoffmann's altitude advantage would be even more pronounced. Marcus led a flight of 4 Mustangs, all modified by Jimmy. They climbed with the bomber formation, going higher and higher until the earth below was a curved horizon and the sky above was turning dark blue. At 29,000 feet, Marcus's engine temperature was perfect. He could stay up here all day if needed. Bandits high. The radio crackled. 3 o'clock. Angels 32. Marcus looked up and saw them. 5 German fighters even higher than the American formation. They were in perfect position to dive on the bombers. And leading them was an aircraft with a distinctive yellow nose marking. Hoffmann's personal fighter. Red flight. Going up, Marcus transmitted. He pushed his throttle forward and pointed his Mustang's nose at the sky. The 4 modified fighters climbed aggressively, something they had never been able to do reliably at this altitude before. The German fighters saw them coming and seemed confused. American escorts did not usually chase them this high. By the time they realized these Mustangs were different, Marcus and his flight were among them. The dogfight happened in thin air, where every movement was exaggerated. Marcus found himself turning with Hoffmann's yellow-nosed fighter in a climbing spiral. Normally, a German fighter would have the advantage at this altitude, but Marcus's Mustang held power and speed. He slowly gained position, his engine running cool and strong. Hoffmann must have realized something was wrong because he broke away and dove hard. But Marcus stayed with him, following through the dive and firing when he got close enough. His tracers walked up the German fighter's fuselage. Smoke burst from Hoffmann's engine. Marcus watched the yellow-nosed fighter go into a spin, trailing dark smoke. He did not see a parachute. Ernst Hoffmann, the Devil of Dortmund, was finished. When the flight returned to base, the other pilots were talking excitedly about the engagement. But waiting near the hangar was Major Stevens, the engineering officer, with his arms crossed and an angry expression on his face. He had been studying the aircraft and had finally noticed the unauthorized modifications. Jimmy Caldwell was about to face the consequences of his rule-breaking. Major Stevens stood in the hangar with his jaw clenched tight. Around him were 6 Mustangs, and under each one he could see the unauthorized modifications to the radiator systems. Sergeant Jimmy Caldwell stood at attention, trying to keep his face neutral while his heart hammered in his chest. "Sergeant, do you understand the concept of military regulations?" Major Stevens asked coldly. "These aircraft are not your personal experiments. Every modification must be approved through proper channels and documented. You have violated about 15 different regulations." "Yes, sir," Jimmy replied. "But, sir, the modifications work. They solve the cooling problem. That is not the point." Stevens's voice rose. "You do not have the authority to redesign military equipment. Engineers with years of training design these systems. You are a mechanic. Your job is to follow the technical manuals, not rewrite them." Behind the major, Lieutenant Marcus Webb and a dozen other pilots had gathered. They stood quietly, but their presence was clear. Jimmy had modified their aircraft, and those modifications had saved lives. "Major Stevens, sir," Marcus spoke up. "Permission to speak." Stevens turned. "Granted, Lieutenant. These modifications have worked perfectly, sir. My aircraft has flown 6 high-altitude missions since Sergeant Caldwell modified it. 0 overheating problems. I have maintained position at altitudes where I previously had to descend. I have protected bombers that would otherwise have been vulnerable. And this morning I shot down Ernst Hoffman." Stevens blinked. "You got Hoffman?" "Yes, sir. At 29,000 feet, full power, engine temperature in the green the entire fight. That would have been impossible 2 weeks ago." Captain Hayes stepped forward. "Sir, I have combat reports from 4 other pilots. All aircraft with Sergeant Caldwell's modifications. 0 mechanical failures. Combined total of 11 enemy fighters destroyed at altitudes where we previously could not maintain power. That is not coincidence, sir." Major Stevens looked around at the pilots. These were combat veterans, men who flew into German airspace and came back with bullet holes in their aircraft. They were not easily impressed. If they supported this mechanic, that meant something. "This is still a court-martial offense," Stevens said, but his voice was less certain. "I have to report this up the chain of command." "Then report it, sir," Marcus said quietly. "But also report that these modifications are saving American lives. We can argue regulations later. Right now, we have a war to win." The next 2 days were tense. Jimmy continued his regular duties, but knew that paperwork was moving up through command channels. A court-martial could mean prison time, dishonorable discharge, disgrace. His mother back in Ohio would be devastated. But something else was happening that Jimmy did not know about. The pilots were organizing. Captain Hayes sat down and wrote a detailed report with precise temperature readings, altitude data, and combat results. He documented every mission flown with modified aircraft. Lieutenant Chun added performance comparisons showing fuel efficiency improvements. They built a case with numbers and facts. More importantly, bomber crews were writing letters. When word spread that the fighters escorting them could now stay at high altitude, the men who flew the B-17s and B-24 started thanking the fighter pilots. And when they learned that one mechanic's unauthorized modification was responsible, they wrote letters to commanders explaining how many lives had been saved. One letter came from Captain David Morrison, a B-17 pilot with the 398th Bomb Group. He wrote, "On the mission to Bremen, my aircraft was damaged and fell behind the formation. 2 Me-109s attacked us. A P-51 with improved high-altitude performance stayed with us at 28,000 feet and drove off both enemy fighters. Without that modification, my crew of 10 men would be dead. I understand the mechanic who created this improvement violated regulations, but he also saved my life and the lives of my crew. There must be room in the military for men who solve problems instead of just following rules." 43 similar letters arrived at wing headquarters over 3 days. Colonel Richardson, the base commander, was a practical man who had flown combat missions in World War I. He read every letter, studied every report, and examined one of the modified aircraft himself. Then he made a decision that surprised everyone that he did not convene a court-martial. Instead, he invited North American Aviation to send their engineering team to examine the modifications. When 3 civilian engineers arrived from the company that built the Mustang, Jimmy expected them to be angry. Instead, they spent 2 days measuring, photographing, and analyzing his work. The lead engineer was a thin man named Dr. Lawrence Chun, who had designed much of the Mustang's original cooling system. "Sergeant Caldwell," Dr. Chun said after his examination, "you have accidentally created what we call a Meredith effect radiator. Do you know what that is?" "No, sir," Jimmy admitted. "I just try to use the airflow more efficiently." The Meredith effect uses the waste heat from cooling to create forward thrust, Dr. Chun explained. "In theory, a perfect design could make the cooling system produce 0 net drag, or even negative drag. We have been trying to achieve this in our designs for 2 years. You accomplished it with hand tools in a hangar at night." Dr. Chun turned to Colonel Richardson. Sir, this modification should be implemented on every P-51 immediately. The performance improvement is significant. Engine cooling is improved by approximately 15% at high altitude. Top speed increases by roughly 8 miles per hour. And combat effectiveness is measurably enhanced. What about the unauthorized nature of the modification? Richardson asked. In normal times, I would say regulations exist for good reasons, Dr. Chen replied. But these are not normal times. Men are dying. Sergeant Caldwell saw a problem and fixed it. Yes, he should have gone through proper channels. But if he had, the approval process would have taken months. How many pilots would have died in those months? Colonel Richardson nodded slowly and looked at Jimmy. Sergeant Caldwell, you violated regulations, and you knew you were doing it. Yes, sir, Jimmy said. You also saved American lives and improved our combat capability. Richardson paused. I am recommending you for a commendation, not a court-martial. The Army needs men who can think and solve problems, not just follow orders blindly. Jimmy felt his knees go weak with relief. Marcus grinned, and several other pilots clapped quietly. 6 months after Jimmy Caldwell's modification was approved, the skies over Germany belonged to the Americans. It was October 1943, and Mustangs with the improved cooling system were pouring out of factories in California and Ohio. Every P-51D model now incorporated Jimmy's radiator design as standard equipment. The impact on the air war was dramatic and measurable. American bomber losses dropped from 10% per mission to less than 3% on escort rates. German fighter pilots reported with frustration that the American escorts could now stay at high altitude indefinitely. The Luftwaffe's advantage at extreme altitude had vanished. Jimmy stood on the flight line at Debden, watching a formation of 36 Mustangs take off for a mission deep into Germany. Every single one carried his modification. It felt surreal. 6 months ago, he had been a sergeant mechanic working secretly at night, terrified of being caught. Now, his design was being built into every Mustang in the world. Thinking about how famous you are, Marcus Webb asked, walking up beside him. Marcus had been promoted to captain and was now a flight commander. He had 15 confirmed kills and was being recommended for the Distinguished Flying Cross. Thinking about all the pilots who will come home because their engines do not overheat, Jimmy replied. That is what matters. The war in Europe was reaching a turning point in late 1943. The Allies were planning an invasion of France for the following summer. Air superiority over Europe was essential for that invasion to succeed. The improved Mustangs were helping to achieve that superiority. German pilots were noticing the change. Luftwaffe reports captured later showed their frustration. One German ace wrote in his diary, "The American Mustangs are now untouchable devils at high altitude. We used to force them down by climbing above them and waiting for their engines to fail. Now they follow us anywhere and their engines run perfectly. We are losing control of our own sky." The German High Command tried various tactics to counter the improved Mustangs. They built faster fighters. They added heavier weapons. They trained pilots in new tactics. But the fundamental problem remained. The P-51 with Jimmy's cooling modification could fly farther, stay at altitude longer, and maintain power in conditions where other fighters struggled. Why December 1943, the Allied Air Forces had flown over 6,000 combat missions with modified Mustangs. The aircraft had destroyed over 1,400 German fighters and countless ground targets. The bomber crews could now strike targets deep in Germany with fighter escort all the way there and back. Jimmy received his commendation from General Carl Spaatz, commander of the U.S. Strategic Air Forces in Europe. The ceremony was held at Wing headquarters with dozens of pilots and officers attending. But what Jimmy remembered most was not the medal or the general's words. It was the bomber crews who lined up afterward to shake his hand. "You saved my life," one pilot told him. "Our escort stayed with us at 30,000 feet over Berlin. Without that, we would have been torn apart." Another crew member, a young gunner who looked about 19, said, "My brother was a fighter pilot. He died when his engine seized a high altitude last spring. If your modification had been available then, he might still be alive. Thank you for saving others." North American Aviation offered Jimmy a job as a civilian engineer with triple his military pay. Dr. Chen personally called to offer him a position on the Mustang development team. But Jimmy declined. "I need to stay here," he explained. "There are still aircraft to fix and pilots to keep flying. The war is not over yet." Marcus understood. "You are where you need to be," he told his friend. "Engineers design aircraft in California, but mechanics keep them flying in England. Both jobs matter." The spring of 1944 brought the final proof of the modification's importance. On D-Day, June 6th, thousands of Allied aircraft supported the invasion of Normandy. Mustangs flew constant patrols over the beaches, protecting the landing forces from German air attack. The Luftwaffe tried desperately to interfere, but was overwhelmed. Allied fighters, including hundreds of modified Mustangs, dominated the sky completely. German fighters that did appear were quickly destroyed or driven off. The cooling modification meant that American fighters could maintain combat air patrol for extended periods without having to land and refuel as frequently. They could chase German fighters at any altitude without worrying about engine problems. The result was total air superiority over the invasion beaches. That be why August 1944, Allied armies were racing across France. The air war had been decisively won. German fighter production was being destroyed by Allied bombing. Experienced German pilots were being killed faster than replacements could be trained. And the Mustang had become the dominant fighter in the European skies. Jimmy Caldwell rotated back to the United States in September 1944. He had served 2 years in England and earned a right to go home. Marcus Webb threw him a farewell party in the officers' club, breaking about 6 regulations by inviting an enlisted man to drink with officers. Nobody cared. The pilots all knew that this mechanic had changed the war. To Jimmy, Marcus raised his glass. Who saw a problem and fixed it? Who broke the rules for the right reasons? Who saved more lives than most pilots ever will? The real hero is not always the guy in the cockpit. 23 pilots raised their glasses. Jimmy felt tears in his eyes, but managed to smile. These men were his brothers. They had trusted him with their lives, and he had not let them down. Years later, after the war ended, Jimmy Caldwell returned to Ohio and opened a small aircraft repair shop. He never became famous outside of military aviation circles. History books mention the improved P-51 cooling system, but rarely mention his name. He did not mind it on quiet days in his shop. He would sometimes see a P-51 Mustang fly overhead. The aircraft had become surplus after the war, and some were owned by private collectors. When he saw one, he would stop work and watch it fly. He knew that every Mustang built after 1943 carried his modification. Thousands of them, all over the world. Marcus Webb visited him once in 1952. The former fighter pilot was now an airline captain. They sat in Jimmy's shop, drinking coffee and remembering England. "You know what the official Air Force history says about the P-51?" Marcus asked. "It says the aircraft became truly effective after a critical cooling system improvement was implemented in 1943. It mentions North American Aviation by name, but it also mentions you, Sergeant James Caldwell, the mechanic who proved that battlefield innovation sometimes matters more than official procedures." Jimmy smiled. That was enough. He had not changed the world to become famous. He had changed it to save lives. And he had succeeded beyond his wildest dreams.